Thank you, Tim, and thank you all for your welcome. When I want to scan along on the PowerPoint presentation, I wave my hand at you or something?
You'll try and give me a nod while I'm sorting out problems, yes.
Oh, cough uncontrolled.
But unfortunately, PowerPoint is the worst software for corrupting the screen.
Okay. I think we could survive without it for a short while, but it sounds like you're almost there.
Yeah, the problem is as soon as I show the slides...
I'll start anyway.
There you go.
Move it on. Okay, let's... Can you get it onto the next page?
Yeah, hold on. Yes, I can.
The title page is not my best work. Okay. All right, well, hopefully you can more or less read that. To the extent that you can't, hopefully I'll be making it clear what it says in any case. Okay, well, to start out with the it wasn't so bad really page. There have been 40, I'm sure we're familiar with this particular stat by now, there have been 45 constitutional referenda since Federation, only 8 of them have succeeded. So what happened on October the 14th, I believe it was, is that we went from 8 out of 44 to 8 out of 45. There has been a lot written over the years as to why this is. Some say the referendum amendment process is too onerous. Am I being waved at or are Relay being waved at?
The mic.
It's not loud enough?
Oh, want to hear it with.
How about now? Is that okay? I have a feeling that you get feedback at a certain point, but so far so good. So, as I said, a lot's been written about the difficulty that we seem to have in changing our constitution. Some say that the process is too onerous, some say that the process for initiating a referendum proposal is not the right way of going about it, insofar as it leaves it entirely up to the executive government of the day. Whatever the reason, the strike rate is low, and it is particularly low under Labor governments. Labor governments seem particularly prone to what I call here failure/lack of bipartisan support. It is a truism about our referendum process that it stands no chance unless there is support for both the major parties for the proposal. And it seems that when Labor governments put forward an idea, either due to the nature of the ideas itself or the blind irrational oppositionism of the Conservative side of politics, it is rarely forthcoming, maybe even never forthcoming when Labor are in government. Labor-initiated referenda seem to do especially badly when they are conducted mid-term and not in conjunction with a general election on the same day. That was the case on this occasion. There have been 11 referendums initiated by Labor governments held in the middle of a term rather than coinciding with an election day. The yes vote at those referendums has ranged from 30.6% to 46.0%. So all of them failed and failed quite badly. Even the best of them only got 46% of the vote nationally and presumably crashed out in a majority of the states. In that context, this referendum seems par for the course. The 39.9% of the vote is actually very marginally at the higher end of the scale out of those 11 referendums. It is equal fourth best out of those 11. So if you want to take comfort in that, that's available to you to do so. You may, however, wonder whether it was tactically the right thing to do to go to the referendum mid-term. Maybe it would have been better to have been conducted on election day. Maybe not. We'll never know, but that's something worth considering. Can we move the PowerPoint along a slide? Apparently not. It's full of text anyway, so I'll continue, and when Jeff's ready. Okay, all right, we are here. Okay, so what I'm trying to do over the next couple of slides is put the referendum in the context of 3 referendum-style events we've had over the last quarter of a century. I should note that they have been diminishing in frequency. There have been far fewer constitutional referendums over the course of the last 20, 30, 40 years than there were in the earlier part of Australian history. Labor governments got sick of beating their head against that particular wall is the way I would rationalise that. It's Labor that tends to be more keen on changing the Constitution. It's a fundamentally conservative document, you might argue, therefore the more progressive the parties is keener on changing the thing. For that reason, perhaps, Conservative oppositions are less inclined to support them, and there has been a repeated record of failure. The three electoral events, as I'm going to call them, because one of them wasn't how we normally in the Australian context, when we say a referendum, we mean a constitutional referendum, and one of the three events, of course, was the same-sex marriage survey / plebiscite, call it what you will. All three of them have in common that they aren't really so much to do with the constitutional machinery of government, but they are to do with broadly progressive political causes, if I could describe them that way, or as I've probably put it more accurately here, issues that tend to pit social progressives against social conservatives. They were, of course, the 1999 Republic referendum, the 2017 same-sex marriage survey, and the 2023 Indigenous voice referendum. What I find particularly interesting about this is that this is what I've referred to here as the newly emerging cleavage in Western democracies. Western democracies, our party system remains structured around the old-fashioned socio-economic cleavage, capital versus labour, which defined electoral democracy in certainly the early 20th century when our party system was coalescing. Increasingly, party systems like ours, which are organised around the working class versus the property-owning, capital-owning classes, are not reflecting where the division is within society that motivates the way people vote. These three referendums, I'll stop beating around the bush and call them referendums, even though one of them wasn't maybe technically that, have all dealt with the new cleavage that is emerging rather than the one that has traditionally separated the Labor from the Liberal parties. On one level, that has been, the fact that in terms of how people identify politically is no longer being reflected as neatly with the division between the two major parties in countries like Australia, has been reflected at elections, at the way people are voting in elections, in two ways. We've seen the rise of minor party voting. People are increasingly or decreasingly identifying with the major parties because of the defining division within how people vote is no longer reflected by the class system that gave rise to them. So they are deciding that they, no longer identify with the Labor Party, nor are they willing to make the leap to the other side, and that gives it fertile ground for the emergence of new parties on both the left and the right. So as I said here, in the Australian context, where the electoral system elevates the concept of the two-party preferred vote, we're unusual in Australia in that we have a system of preferential voting. You can rebel against the major parties by voting for a minor one, but in the final analysis, you do have to put one major party ahead of the other in order to cast a formal vote. So it remains, whereas, we'd be having a very different conversation if we had a proportional representation system, as most European countries do. And, look at Germany at the moment. It seems that their, traditional two-party system is completely falling apart. In Australia, the electoral system continues to sort voters into Labor and coalition columns, whether they want to be there or not. In that context, we are seeing that the newly emerging division is starting to describe the way votes sort out better than the old previous traditional system where, working class people voted Labor, middle class people voted Liberal, and whether or not they were socially progressive or not did not really enter the equation. Now, how are we doing here? Can we...
Do you want another screen?
I do want another screen.
Sorry, it's just that they're getting a silent movie on the Zoom, so I'm trying to solve it.
Okay. All right, well, then I'll be quick in dealing with this one, which you do need to see. Here I am illustrating the point that from the 1999 Republic referendum to the 2023 Indigenous voice referendum, Similar sorts of people were voting in the same sorts of ways at those two referendums. What we're seeing here is that by 2023, this is better describing the spread of the Labor two-party preferred vote than it did back in 1999. On the left, we see each of those dots represents an electorate. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is that the dots are lining up in a more linear fashion in 2023 than they were in 1999. In both cases, there's a positive relationship. The higher the Labor two-party vote is in a given electorate, the more likely it is to be voting yes. But the pattern is a lot clearer in the more recent of the events than it was in 1999. That line, which represents the line of best fit that best approximates the spread of all those points, the dots tend to be closer to the line on the right than they do on the left. There's a lot more spread on the left. The Labor two-party preferred vote was a less good way of predicting how the Republic vote was going to go than it proved to be in the case of the Indigenous voice. In particular, we've got a cluster of dots in the top right of the Indigenous voice scatter plot on the right. I didn't even need to look to be able to tell you this. I can guarantee you that those are all the inner city seats that are now being won by the Greens. We're now looking there at Melbourne, Brisbane, Ryan, and other seats that conceivably go Green at some point in the future.
Perth voted yes.
Perth?
Perth voted yes.
Perth did indeed vote yes. That's did Curtin, just. But the Greens vote is probably a better proxy than any of this. Like the Teal seats voted yes, but not as emphatically as the sorts of seats where the Greens did well, and without having checked, I suppose, Fremantle and Perth are the strongest seats for the Greens in Western Australia. So to itemise that statistically, the Labor two-party vote explains 42% of the variation in the yes vote at electorate level for the Indigenous voice, whereas back in '99 for the Republic, it was only 13%. The correlation was there, but it is now so much stronger. Okay, that's where I've got. Okay, now can we move along another slide?
If you ask nicely.
And we're not quite getting it all on the screen here, which serves me right for...
Don't need so much I can do about that.
Serves me right for doing what PowerPoint recommended I do to make it look prettier. Yeah, that's better. Okay, so what I've done here is done sort of statistical modelling to analyse relationships between demographic variables and how people voted at the three referendums that I'm discussing going back to 1999. To describe what we're looking at in probably a slightly bewildering set of data we've got there on the right, let's sort of keep focused at the top end there, if we can, if we can't. Okay, I've basically got 5 demographic variables that I'm using to test the extent to which those variables relate to the results of the 3 referendums. And what we're seeing, if it's green or red, that means the result is statistically significant. If it's not green or red, you can probably ignore it. If it's green, it means that the correlation is positive. If it's red, it means that it's negative. I can best explain what that means by taking a specific example. At all 3 of the referendums, we see that the cells are green. What that means is that the more educated an electorate was, the higher its yes vote tended to be. And because this is the linear regression model, that holds true when you have other factors, independently of all the other factors that I'm including here. So it's not just that people tend to be more educated in Victoria, although that is in fact the case. Even independently of that, it is the case that the more people had completed high school, is the variable that I happen to use, the higher the vote for yes was at all 3 of these referendums, all of which involve what might broadly be called socially progressive causes. The variables that went the other way were a little more patchily income and the percentage of the population that speaks Chinese languages, which is how I've itemised that. The other variable that associates with the yes vote is what I've called secular, which is the proportion of the population who, in the census, say that they have no religious affiliation. Did someone have a question?
No, it's just taking.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure. Okay, so that's, quite aside from the question of how people vote, these demographic factors are also useful in helping you guess how an electorate might have voted even without looking at the results. If they're educated electorates, if they are not religiously observant electorates, they tended to vote yes. But when you throw higher incomes into the equation, the way I'd look at the income thing is that if you look at education together with income, if you have an electorate where people are wealthy but not necessarily of high educational attainment, they tend to be voting no in these sorts of referendums. I could make sneering remarks about cashed up bogans or big mansions, all these sorts of things, but that's not how I play the game. Then those are the kinds of categorisations that you would fall upon. The Chinese community also seems to be a source of social conservatism, notwithstanding that the Chinese community is well educated. So the magic of this sort of analysis is that it holds the other variables level. Other things being equal, if an electorate has more Chinese people in it, then it would have voted more no than yes than you would have expected, taking into account its level of income, education and the rest. Now, I think the point that I want to make here at the bottom is the one that matters, and happily it's not obscured. Both the Chinese community and the secular community, if it could be called that, have increased in numbers quite considerably since the Republic referendum was held in 1999. So both of these are emerging phenomena. The number of people who said they primarily spoke Chinese languages at home went from, I said 4.0% to 2.1%, that should be the other way around. It went from 2.1% to 4.1% over 20 years in the course of censuses. The Chinese-speaking share of the overall Australian population just about doubled over those 20 years. The secular, as I describe it, population also pretty much doubled, almost exactly over the 20 years. People are increasingly inclined, when filling out their census, to tick the box saying, I have either secular beliefs, whatever that might mean, or I have no religious affiliation. This is a good proxy for support for socially progressive causes. Electorates which have a lot of people saying that they aren't of a religious persuasion tend to be the electorates that are voting heavily for the Greens or Teal independents. Could we whack her along another? What have I got next? Okay, now what I did just now is an attempt to look at voting at the macro level. There are pitfalls in doing that. It doesn't necessarily mean that Chinese people are voting the way that I said they were, just because electorates with a lot of Chinese people in them did that. It probably means that. In fact, in this case, I'm pretty certain it does. But if you really want to know how a demographic cohort is voting, then you actually have to go out and ask them rather than just assume based on how the people in their area are voting in aggregate. So the best we can do is nasty old opinion polls. And this is one from immediately before the referendum was held. This is a news poll now conducted by Pixis Polling, which was conducted from October the 4th to October the 12th. The referendum date, if memory serves, was October the 14th. So this tells you a lot of things which no doubt seem intuitively true to us all. Women were more inclined than men, or at least less uninclined, to vote in favour of the Indigenous voice. What we've got here is men going 61-34 against women only 53-40. Even more strikingly, there is a marked effect in terms of age cohorts. With each increase up the age cohort ladder, the greater opposition to the voice became. And, you know, if you want to be optimistic about the future, you can highlight the fact that the 1834 cohort did vote in favour of the voice, not overwhelmingly, but according to this, 52-43, accounting for the fact that we've got a 5% unconverted rating here. Progressively decreasing until we get to those awful old boomers who voted 28% yes and 68% no, at least according to this opinion poll, and naturally with present company accepted. Education, all right, this is pleasing to see when education bears out what my macro level analysis was telling me. The more educated a person was, the more likely they were to vote yes. That comes through both at survey level and at the level of how people voted at the electorate. University educated people, again, not overwhelmingly, nothing was overwhelmingly in favour at this referendum, unfortunately from a yes perspective, but 51-44 in favour. Going down to no tertiary education, 62 to 31% against. Moving right along. Now the point I want to make here is that okay, anyway, it's all good.
Next one? Or
Yeah, next one. Now, the polling wasn't just an academic exercise, I don't think, at this referendum, because it fed into the results, or rather perceptions of how people were going to vote had a big role to play in what actually happened, because it seemed to me that the real, killer strategy that the No campaign pursued was putting two Indigenous people front and centre of the campaign. Those people, of course, being Jacinta Price and young guy Warren Mundine. This persuaded a great many people that the Indigenous community was divided at best, and led to a bit of culture warring going on between the two camps as to whether it was actually true. The impression that the No camp assiduously courted that in fact it is not the case that the Indigenous community is united in favour or support of this. If anything, they're leaning against. So we have 4 items of opinion polling that were conducted through the course of 2023.
We might need to wrap it up this time.
Okay, well this is the second last slide, and the last one we can probably do with that. So we had 4 items of opinion polling. Look, throughout the 2023, whichever measure you looked at, support deteriorated as the year progressed. Now, we have very limited data available on how Indigenous people were actually voting, but such as it is, it's consistent with that decline, but also with Indigenous people being very heavily in favour. So at the start of the year, we had 80 and 83% results, which the Yes campaign were very keen to promote. And I think they could reasonably be faulted for continuing to be keen to promote that 80% figure after it had probably dropped a little bit. Later polling, very small samples, I have to make that qualification. One came in at 59%, I'm a bit dubious for that one for reasons I'll shortly describe. The other one came in at 70%, I think that's probably more likely. I think the best information we've got is that the yes vote among Indigenous people fell from about 80% to about 70%. So in order to wrap it up, I will just have a quick look at the final slide, which is an attempt to ascertain whether the actual pattern of voting can tell us anything about how Indigenous people ended up voting. Certainly it does so in Indigenous communities. And what I've got here is the 6 most Indigenous electorates in the country, and the relationship between indigeneity in particular areas of those electorates and the yes vote. So what we're seeing is that in each of these electorates, because there's a very marked contrast, in particular an electorate like Lingiari, which is the Northern Territory outside of Darwin, that is an area where you get predominantly white communities in Alice Springs, but you also have outback remote communities which are overwhelmingly Indigenous. In every one of these sorts of electorates, the picture comes through very clearly. The more Indigenous an area was, the more heavily it was voting in favour of yes. And on that basis, I found that the remote mobile team booths that service Indigenous communities, it did actually approach 80%. In a couple of other places like Palm Island, which were heavily Indigenous, we were sort of looking at about 75%, a little lower in some cases. So I think you can be pretty conservative in saying that in these sorts of communities, at least 70% of people were voting yes, which I think gave lie to the impression that the No campaign was trying to give. I must stress, however, that over 80% of Indigenous people don't actually live in Indigenous communities, and after the campaign was over, we saw some attempts to say, oh, but it was the Indigenous people who didn't live in Indigenous communities who were against it. Well, we can't know that. You know, they are mixed together with the broader population, and the signal just doesn't come through the noise in the case of urban communities. Clearly, however, where the population was overwhelmingly Indigenous, support was extremely strong. And I'm sensing increasing impatience. But happily, I have reached the conclusion anyway, so it is now time to throw over to MC Timmy D. And thank you.
Thank you very much, William. And look, if I just ask our panellists to take a seat. And please ignore the occupational health and safety hazard that's just in the corner there. What we're looking to do is just have our panellists do a brief response. So I'm going to choose the simple one of going down the table. So I might start with Daniel.
So, as Tim mentioned, my name is Daniel Morrison-Bird. I'm proud Noongar Yamaji Ngija man. I'm the CEO of Wanjaning Aboriginal Corporation here in Perth, and have been for the last nearly 14 years. So first of all, I'd like to like to acknowledge that we are on Whadjuk land today and pay our respects to both past and present elders of this beautiful country that we sit on today. It has certainly been a tough time over the last month for myself and for my family and for people that I've been talking to within the community, mostly the Aboriginal people, but it's been overwhelming support that I've been receiving and hearing from non-Aboriginal people as well. So it's been great. It's no doubt that the mob are hurting right now and have been over the last month, and it's something that we probably should have prepared for a lot better than what we did, but we really had a lot of hope and a lot of faith in the system and in Australia that they would make the right decisions and based on what was put forward. But unfortunately, there was a lot of lies and fear that was put out into the community that people actually ended up voting on. But throughout the course of the campaign, it was very clear that what yes would be and a yes outcome would be, and that it would be about brighter and more successful communities throughout Australia around Aboriginal people, and a brighter future for Aboriginal communities and people and families right across this country. Over the campaign and leading up to the actual referendum, we have seen a large number of volunteers that came out in force. I think on actual referendum day, we actually seen 60,000+ volunteers that participated and helped us in the hope to get over the line with a yes result, but not to happen at this stage. And they were all acknowledging that it's the right thing to do. At Wanjaning ourselves, we were able to develop a Wanjaning campaign in partnership with Yes 23 and most of the Labor members across Perth Metro, both state and federal. So we worked with some other Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, but us being the lead in really making sure that we're getting out there, having conversations with the community. We deliver a wide range of services, including justice, child protection, alcohol and drugs, and homelessness. And And it's something that we've been able to get out there and have conversations with the wider community around what works well when Aboriginal people are leading it and working for, and when programs are being worked in for and by Aboriginal community, we're getting better outcomes. So we hope that would really get across the line and really demonstrate the need for the voice. And once the voice is in place, we could really make a positive impact going forward. Throughout Wangening, we've got 260 staff across Perth Metro, and we had a whole range of staff, particularly Aboriginal staff from within Wangening, that participated in door knocking in partnership with the S23, wobble boarding and phone banking. All the way from Hillary's down to Armidale. We participated in different door knocking activities and wobble boarding, which was great. As I said, having Aboriginal people talking about Aboriginal issues was fundamental to the campaign, and I don't think there was enough of that, so that's why Wangening ourselves, we tried to lean in and get more of that happening, because we feel that was a big gap within the campaign. We needed more of that. Interesting hearing this presentation. Because from our point of view, we really looked at it as well as a grassroots campaign. We saw the end result that majority of Aboriginal people voted yes, and so true to the dialogue and the communication and the campaign messages, that majority of Aboriginal people across the country do want it and did want it, and that was no surprise to me. I've known my community and my leaders over many generations have been calling and lobbying and advocating for a voice mechanism, advocating for Aboriginal people to be at the table and to be part of solution making in relation to our issues. My parents, for one, are a big part of that. They've been working in the space for 50 odd years, and I've heard many times when the arguments have been put forward that we need to be at the table, we need our mob at the table to be able to make informed changes and get better results for our community. Regions with a high proportion of Aboriginal people overwhelmingly voted yes, and that's what I said. So, and some of that was confirmed with Bill's presentation. But yeah, there's how we break that down, and that the detail of that was really interesting to hear. The yes vote in polling catchments where Aboriginal people formed more than 50% on average, and where that showed in favour of enshrining the voice to Parliament. So it's really interesting to see the data and see it presented the way it was. But yeah, I feel like a beer now. So it shows that the claims from the no camp that Aboriginal communities didn't want it and didn't support it were again lies. It was always majority Aboriginal people wanting this. I knew that and I felt that. And the data does support that, maybe not to the extent of 80 or 83, but definitely in high numbers, and high enough numbers that would generally get people elected any other election. We know what works best for our families and our communities, and the results show that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people wanted to implement change for the better, and the status quo that we live in now isn't working for our communities, and that's what we wanted to see different going forward. As a community, over the last month, we've had a chance to really regroup and come back together, dust ourselves off, as we've done too many times. But we're quite good at that once you look at the ups and downs that we've had over many generations and decades. But yeah, it's something that we can do. We can't change the result of the referendum, but what we can do is work together and also take advantage of the 40% that we do have now backing us. It's not the 3%, it's the 40%. So there's a lot of positives that we need to really think about going forward. Over the coming months, we've seen, and I'm hearing about senior leaders coming together and both non-Aboriginal and Aboriginal and working out a path forward as how we can come back together. For now, we will continue to advocate that it's nothing about us without us, and delivering programs run for, by Aboriginal people is proven to get better results, and so that's something that we will continue to advocate for. Government at all levels need to continue to have Aboriginal people at the table when making decisions about Aboriginal people, and there's a clear request from the Aboriginal community for government to do that. And even though we didn't win the referendum, I think there's a big enough community groundswell that should still happen, whether it's enshrined or not. Yep, I've got 2 more things. I look forward to continuing working with you all, and we've got an opportunity to grow from 40% to over 50%, so hopefully 60% next time. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, and I just want to say thank you for all coming today and giving your time to us.
With the speaker's mind speaking to the mic, we've got chatting going on out there and it cuts on half the room.
I wonder if I can move this a bit closer. Maybe twist it. Yeah. You just twist it. Is that better? Yeah. Yay! Oh, that's fine. So first of all, I just want to say thank you to everyone for being here and giving your time. Just because this is a very raw moment for us, and I can only speak for myself in saying I was very disappointed, as was many of our people and many of our allies as well, because of the hard work and the momentum that went into trying to educate people around the injustice for 3% of this population in our country. And for me, I think, our ancestors have done a great job in caring for this land, this country, for everybody to celebrate that. And when it came to the most part of us being recognised in the Constitution, something that is way overdue, the results were devastating. And I just want to reinforce the fact that, we did have a lot of hope, faith and trust in the Australian people. When I say the Australian people, I'm not referencing those who voted yes and our allies. I'm referencing those who voted no. And that trust has now been broken. And so there's a lot of healing that we need to do with our own people and our communities, but we still open that door for Australian people, especially our allies, to walk beside us. We do know on reflection what it has demonstrated and what has come through very loud and very clear in the lead up to the referendum, that Australia is built on systemic racism and that racism is alive and well and thriving in this country. And I can only speak because if you've seen a lot of that social media, myself included, switched off for our own mental, emotional and spiritual well-being, to be able to get up every morning and say, this is our country, this is our rightful place in this land, and we shouldn't have to face this. And the struggles our ancestors went through just for us to survive. We talked about past policies. They were a form of genocide, and today we're seeing that coming through very strongly and very clearly, where our people are still dying, and just recently a lot of our people are still dying, the young, the old, but the people that there is racism in the system. And so where to from here? I think there needs to be, we have the Uluru Statement from the Heart, still going to keep it alive. It's a beautiful document, it's a gift. We've now, the voices striked off, there needs to be truth telling. We talked about education and it came through very strong in the polls. When people are educated to understand the Indigenous history of this land, their knowledge, their experience of where they're advocating with and on behalf of us, which we need the Australian people to understand that, to be able to support us around all these areas of injustices. We talk about the United Nations of the Declaration on Rights of the Indigenous People. We are not having the justice for our people under that Australia is supposed to support. A lot of Australian people don't understand that. They don't even know that. I think there's a lot of truth-telling that needs to be told, and I think for a long time we have spoken about our history. It's also Australian people acknowledging and owning their history and the contribution to that, which is what really reconciliation is about. But I look forward to speaking to every one of you after the session. Thank you.
Hello everyone. I want to start by just reflecting on where we ended up as Yes 23 in WA. By the time we got to the 14th of October, we had nearly 4,000 volunteers in WA. A majority of those volunteers were first-time volunteers. They had come to this campaign just for Yes 23 and recognition of our First Nations people in the Constitution. These volunteers made around 70,000 phone calls in WA, and they knocked on about 50,000 doors. That's pretty amazing for a grassroots organisation that was built up only in the year beforehand. Some of the key things I want to really reflect on from William's presentation, one of the first things was that 2PP, when we talked about the Labor electorates. It really reflects on what we were all experiencing out on the field. I really see the campaign as a campaign in two parts. That first campaign was building capacity. We were getting our volunteers, training up and getting them ready. And that was happening in the inner city electorates, like Fremantle, like Perth that we're into, and Curtin. We were getting so many volunteers there, and we weren't seeing that in the outer suburbs. So the campaign was in two parts. First part was build capacity, and then flip it over into the outer suburbs. So by the end of the campaign, sort of 6 weeks out from the campaign, we were able to flip over to focusing on the outer suburbs. We were able to turn 70 to 80,000 people out into the outer suburbs. No, 70 to 80 people on a day out into the other suburbs to door knock in Rockingham. So this was something that we really noticed, and it correlates with what William said. The other thing is the Kimberley vote. There was a lot of activity up in the Kimberley, especially from the Kimberley Land Council, about making sure mob were involved. They had roadshows that they ran, and they had it in multiple parts, going out and informing the community that they were coming out, then heading out and having the sessions. They would have key spokespeople from Yes 23 come out. So actively having the mob and the community involved really helped with making sure everyone was on board with the message. And the last thing I really want to focus on was what we did with the cold communities. We identified early on that we needed to engage with cold communities, and we had a national cold community, culturally and linguistically diverse, so multicultural communities. So we had a multicultural community leaders, we had ambassadors in WA who were going out and speaking to these communities and engaging with these communities, because these were the key things from William's information that we were already reflecting on and we were already aware that needed to be addressed. Thank you.
All good?
Can you do that?
Hear me? No? Come forward. All right. Is that better? Yeah. All right. I did media for the campaign here in WA. and I just wanted to talk a little bit about the response following the result. I think there's a lot of talk at the moment about disinformation and lies, and how do you fact check the lies? How do you stop the lies? And I think that's perhaps the wrong way of looking at what happened. I think the disinformation that we saw, it was often not that people were believing the lies, it was that they were being encouraged in their worst instincts and then being given these lies that they could use for cover. One example was here in WA, people claiming that the Heritage Bill had changed them from being yes supporters to no supporters. And then as soon as we scrapped the Act, the Liberals used that as an excuse to say that now they were going to no longer support the bill. And I think also looking at the results, if the Heritage Bill had been that persuasive, we would have been the worst, and we were only the third worst. The No campaign afterwards claimed that Aboriginal people, after claiming that they were against the Voice and seeing the evidence of the remote booths, they then changed to claim that the people in those remote booths were tricked or taken advantage of. I think what we need to look at is the fact that what we're dealing with is people who are not so much liars as bullshitters, in the sense that Harry Frankfurt wrote about a few decades ago. They're people that don't care about the truth either way. They use lies when it helps, they use the truth when it helps. And I think that's a much different problem that we have to start thinking about. But I think the first thing we have to do is acknowledge that when we listen to people's commentary on how we could have changed the Yes campaign to be more successful, when we have people from the No side saying they would have voted for it if we'd split the two aspects of it, they would have voted for it if it was just recognition. We need to stop taking their word for that, because they've proven that they don't care about the truth and that they'll lie to get their way. So I think the big key for all of us now in the broader media and social media and in individual conversations is facing that truth that what we're dealing with is people who don't care about what the facts are. And I think one of the first things we need to do is to make more forceful claims for our own side. So I think one of the things that we probably should consider about the Yes campaign is how perhaps wishy-washy we were sometimes on claiming the benefits of the Voice. We wanted to say this was going to be life-changing, but also it wouldn't change anything at all, that it would be really, really powerful, but that it would have no official power. We need to, I think, to cut through all of that nonsense, be more forceful in what we're saying to people and defending our ideas, and I think that's probably the first solution. But before that, I think it's the job of us modulars to listen as we go into those next stages and find out what it is that Aboriginal people want to do next.
Okay, thank you very much to all our panellists. Now, and thank you all very much for your patience, and those people who are online. We're slightly truncating this. But we might say, first of all, William, did you have any particular response to what the other panellists have been saying? Particularly, something that struck me about your presentation was where the contours of a coalition for change might be, based on your where you see the vote or the positive yes vote going.
I think it's difficult to get an answer for that out of something as blunt as the aggregate level of data that was coming through. I think it's something that you need survey data to get to the bottom of that. I think, Amanda made some salient points about the fact that, you need to be a little bit wary about what people are telling you when they respond to an opinion poll. people were overwhelmingly positive about the Indigenous voice this time a year ago. And now we're getting a lot of talk out there that, you know, if it had just been about Indigenous recognition, you know, if it had been purely about putting some sort of preamble into the Constitution, we'd have very happily voted for that. I think you need to be wary of people telling you that, because once the campaign for such a referendum got into process, Conservative High Court judges would be coming out writing columns saying that this is a stalking voice for radical change and it's not as innocuous as it looks, and the Conservative media machine would have a big incentive to sort of fire this up as something to get their base angry about, and all of these sorts of things would happen, and you would have that same, you know, thing that you generally get in constitutional referendums in Australia, which is just a sort of apathetic fallback upon a no vote. You know, I don't understand this, you know, don't broke it, don't fix it, you know, the sorts of conservative folk wisdom that seems to encourage no votes. So, yeah, that was, I think, the main thing that came through for me there. There was another one which will come to me in a minute, which I'll jump up and seize the microphone off you when it does, but for the time being, I think that was the main point that came through for me there.
Okay, so part of what we're asking our panellists to do at this point is to reflect on, of course, the path forward, where to from here. People like Kyra has already made some reflections on that. But if any of the other panellists have a particular view that they'd like to put forward about sort of what would be the next steps in well, what we broadly call Indigenous affairs, but really we should think of it in terms of a justice for First Nations people. Don't all storm up at once, but yeah.
So, to be honest, I don't think it's for me to say what's next. There's definitely still, as has been mentioned, people grieving the outcome and asking for more healing time. So while there are lots of people anxious about what's next, we need to give them time to grieve. In saying that, I'm aware that the Reconciliation Network, Reconciliation Australia and the state bodies are meeting regularly to discuss next steps. And I think we just need to stay ready, ready to step up when we're asked to. And even there's an option to link in with mobs in your area to see what's going on in the ground, to be part of things locally until we're ready to do anything nationally.
I'll just say briefly, we need to keep the discussion and the momentum going for our people, and even engaging with companies or organisations like Wandening to see how you could support the work that they do around having a positive impact on our people. Keep those discussions going with people. I know with a lot of people that I've connected with, allies, you know, we've seen this happen in COVID and it's happening now. Especially with the referendum, relationships have been broken in families and friendships just over this. But it's still important to fight for justice, especially for the most vulnerable group, who are the First Nations people in this country.
Well, I just want to say, like, I agree with Kyra and Dennis that it's really about continuing the conversations. If you ask the Aboriginal community, who are still hurting and still grieving, how to fix something that we had no power in, and we had no say in being only 3%, and even less when you're talking about voting public. So it's a bit, I find it a bit hard to really respond to a question such as that, but I would really encourage conversations to keep going, the kitchen table discussions, the lounge rooms, and really get into the homes of the wider Australian public. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, what we can do is open up for at least a short bit of time for questions from the audience. Now, I will stress questions because I have to repeat them back into the microphone and my memory is really bad. So, and I saw Phil over there ask the question.
I think we built up a pretty good effort in Western Australia. If I had 400 people volunteer to do phone banks, you could organise a hell of a lot, and we did that. Mostly, the white fellas sat around for most of the beginning of this year waiting for an Aboriginal person to pull a starter's gun. And some of the best campaigners in the States were doing nothing, so they'd be happy to. And as soon as the starter gun eventually got fired, they started jumping in. And then we were able to train the new people. So you can spend a lot of time thinking about what you want to do, but all that goodwill will dissipate if you don't start talking about a few concrete things that you can do with what was built up here. I don't know what happened in the rest of the country, but I know what happened here is we built up some real capacity. It was mostly non-Aboriginal people. So my question is this. How are most of the non-Aboriginal leadership are like the two of you, have never been involved in a campaign like this before, like most of the volunteers. So the experienced campaigners, people like Dennis and Amanda, were not surprisingly the mainstream of Australia that are involved in politics. We have to find a way for the two to work together to make the most. And how do you think that should happen?
Okay. So thank you for following my instructions, Phil.
Now rephrase it.
Can you rephrase that to, yes.
What does the co-leadership model look like?
Yes. What does the leadership model for a campaign going forward look like, given that we have a lot of experienced campaigners, we've had, or at least we seem to have at the beginning of this year, a lot of motivation, and the post-election, post-referendum result, how do we bring that together to move forward?
Kyra just said, no, and it is true. We need to come together as a group or as a group of campaigners. There's a good cohort of Aboriginal leaders and Aboriginal people that have been part of the campaign throughout the campaign and leading up to the referendum. But yeah, we can't do it alone. So we need to be walking alongside and working alongside non-Aboriginal people and allies to really co-design an approach or a framework or a structure or a system that we can work within. But no one party can do it on our own. So it's probably a good starting point that we come together and use this now that we've had a bit of a breathing space and dusting ourselves off. But you're right, Phil, we need to continue to keep the momentum, keep the right people around the table and look at a way forward.
I think how do we collaborate with Reconciliation WA here in this state to do like a truth-telling and leverage off all of our allies and volunteers to be part of that discussion, to go out into the wider communities, organisations, to be able to take the next step which is the truth-telling of this country. And there's a question at the back.
Could you share how you might see that truth-telling happening? I mean, given that the systemic racism sort of fed into the lack of education, which fed into the no vote, how are those no voters going to receive the truth-telling?
Oh, look, the no voters will receive it. They'll feel uncomfortable. But as I tell people, people feel uncomfortable with the truth regardless of what that truth is, because there's a level of guilt that they hold on to that they feel, but only they know why they feel that way, and that's a journey they have to take as individuals. But it's not about, cracking the whip and making people feel guilty about the history. We can't change the past, but it's what we can do here and now to change the future, and education will be a part of that. And I think that came very strongly through the polls. People who were more educated understood the injustice to vote the yes. And with the truth-telling, whether that's a Makarrata Commission, whatever that may look like, I think here in WA we have a great opportunity of how we frame that, how we co-design that, how we collaborate that, to work with everybody to come on that journey and how we influence that more broadly in society. Yes?
Yes. First, I would like to say that you're not alone in your grieving. Even my 9-year-old was asking me, Mum, Australia voted no, and we grieve, and we still talk about it. I understand that you want the discussion going on, especially us being the people who want really to act. Have you ever thought that these many volunteers that are really ready to do some actions, to get them to help the Aboriginal community in any sort that they can, meanwhile that they're doing the discussion with the whites and, other side, put us to work to do something to close the gap or do something to help actually, because obviously we are all ready to help, Have you ever thought of that?
Look, I think that there's been, just through the campaign has shown that support with our allies. It's already been happening in my experience in the space that I work in, but I work in a corporate renewable energy space, but I also tap into identifying the stakeholders as well that we need to co-design and work collaboratively to be able to get the impact that we're aiming to achieve. And it's no different to doing that. So while we've got the momentum, I'm sure we can pick up some of those discussions and move it forward, Bill. And how we co-design the framework and identify the stakeholders that need to be a part of it so that we can actually get our allies to work and delegate where that will be around the work that they do, the skills that they bring, the knowledge that they bring, just to keep the momentum and the actions going to move forward. Yes? Anybody else?
You're doing a great job.
I feel like a politician standing up here. No offence, but yeah. Next question?
Okay, so we had a question at the back and then we had a question down the side and we might wrap it up after that.
It's not as much a question, it's a bit of a follow-on from what was being discussed. My friend and I are sitting here talking and saying that as volunteers we don't know each other that well, and potentially that idea of being able to continue the momentum might be possible if we form some networks and start to grow that connection and that alliance that we all have with each other and with Aboriginal people. And I was just hoping that might be something that we can talk to you about, Phil, or somebody.
I agree.
I just thought that would be a great.
I think Dennis and I have had conversations that we are so proud of how we collaborated in WA, bringing together, like we had Reconciliation WA, we had Reconciliation Australia supporting Reconciliation WA, we had the Uluru Statement from the Heart, we had the Yes Campaign. We all work together collaboratively in how we can shift and move the minds of WA people with the work that we had to do, and it's no different. While we got the momentum, I think, bringing the volunteers into that space, bringing them into the Reconciliation WA space, to be able to work with organisations like Wunjinning and many others right around WA, the Kimberley Land Council, around the work that we can do. We all have something that we can bring to the table. It's just how we bring it and what that looks like.
So, Corporate Australia, we had a lot of corporations supporting the Yes campaign. Were they basically media releases, or do you think that there are alliances that can be forged now and they can play a part in reconciliation?
Look, I've voiced very strongly in the corporate space because of the work that I've done, and I know reconciliation action plans. I've seen the shift and the change over time where people didn't get access to contracts, whether it's state or federal, if they didn't have a RAP in place. So in order to weigh into them actually winning a contract, they had to have a RAP. Unfortunately, the intention of people having the RAP hasn't played out through the Yes 23 campaign, and corporates do have a very strong role to play in that. It's about the injustices to First Nations people. I've seen a lot of the corporates say, we'll put out the statement, but then there's people that work for those corporate companies that actually sat on the fence line and go, oh, this is political. Of course, injustice to our people is going to be political. It's always been political in this country because we are the minority group. So yes, it's about how we influence and hold them accountable with their staff as well. And that's where you can also play a space around how you influence people in that space as well. With corporates, they have a very strong role to play.
We might need to
is there just one question? Is there money in the campaign coffers to keep a campaign running, to keep the voice out there?
We wouldn't know that, no.
Well, is that possible? Is it possible to do that? I mean, one of the suggestions I'm putting forward all over LinkedIn is a voice to Parliament and everywhere else, meaning start to sing the stories.
I can speak to this. I don't know about the campaign, but I know Reconciliation WA do that. So they get corporate.
I can't hear it on the lift or at Woolies.
No.
I'm talking about making it. Let every Australian hear a voice.
Okay, we've had enough.
Hey, no worries.
Okay.
Okay, look, we might just begin to wrap it up.